writers can, will, and have come up with some very strange stories, but what if reality is weirder than anything that's ever been seen in fiction? And speaking of weird fiction and weird reality, what happens in each of them when memory fails and time breaks? It's a very ominous pair of questions, and I have a very not ominous guest on this episode to help me with them. It's Abrahamsen, one of the founding members of Paper Republic, and actually the editor of our story for this episode, or the editor of the translation of it. Our story is Flock of Brown Birds by Ge, a particularly strange, disjointed, and occasionally creepy tale. It's amazing, by the way. Very much been looking forward to do this episode, and here it is now for your listening pleasure. So first thing we're going to do is a little quick listener feedback section. So one little interesting is not the right word, one gratifying or just happy piece of feedback I got from a couple of listeners was about our guest on the episode about Yang Lian, Brian Holton. Some of you guys really loved him. There was some concern as to how intelligible he might be for English as a second language speakers, but you know what? Even if you don't understand precisely the meaning of what myself and Brian were talking about, because we might have come a little bit too Scottish for international audiences, I think you got the good vibes that were coming across. And honestly, what a great guest he was. If you've not listened to the episode on Yang Lian's narrative poem with its translator, Brian Holton, do it. It's a great episode. We had a more kind of, what can I say, critical or philosophical little piece of discussion on the TrChFic Discord group, our little group chat for fans. We were musing over whether the fantasy series by Regina F. Kwang, The Poppy War, counts maybe sounds a little bit too much of a value statement, a value judgment, whether it can be called Chinese literature or not. This is a series of fantasy books written in English, set in kind of a magical version of China, inspired by Chinese history and some people from it. The author is it's R.F. Kwang, Rebecca F. Kwang, I believe, who was born in China, moved to the US at 4, and got all her education in the US, although undergraduate education was in Cambridge in the UK, I think. So with all that information, would it make sense to call her fantasy series Chinese literature or not? There was a little bit of difference in opinion as to like the right descriptive term for that series in our Discord, all in good humour, of course. But if this is a debate, maybe debate sounds a bit too heavy, if this is a discussion you'd like to weigh in on, then just look out for the join link to the Discord. That's in the Linktree list of links that I have pinned at the top of my Twitter, and it's also in the Instagram bio, the TrChFic's Instagram bio. So yeah, if you'd like to weigh in on that, or lots of the other discussions we have in the Discord, that's how you can do that. That's all for our listener feedback segment. Now let's go on to the news, the TrChFic news. So our first news item is about, yet again, the author Chen Qiufan. So, yet again, he's done a little interview with an English language media outlet. This one is Sixth Tone, who specialise on, I guess, all things China. It's a really cool little online publication. So the interview, or no, sorry, it's not an interview, is it? It's an article. The article is titled "Trapped by a Pandemic, Decoding Messages from Other Worlds." Sci-fi writer Chen Qiufan reflects on dystopia fear and the meaning of world literature at a time of crisis. So yeah, it's his thoughts basically on. Well, I don't need to describe it, do I? Because the subtitle just described it perfectly. But yeah, that's up on Sixth Tone. I will put a link to that in the show notes. that's our first item of news. Our second item of news comes via Paper Republic and the Centre for New Chinese Writing, both of which I've talked about oh so many times on the show, so I'm just going to read this little post. Paper Republic partners with Lead Centre for New Chinese Writing, Give It a Go literary translation. What better way to spend lockdown than having a shot at literary translation? You know you always wanted to try it, so why not have a go now? Paper Republic and the Lead Centre for New Chinese Writing have partnered up to offer an essay by Deng Anqing as a piece for first-time translators, and then they've got a link there. The deadline is 30th April. I'm recording this now on the 21st, so hopefully you guys will listen in time. Well, those of you who wish to take part and hadn't heard about this opportunity yet, hopefully in the narrow window that you'll have between this episode going up, you catching the episode and the deadline of this thing, that your shot at translating that article will be something that can be completed. Oh my goodness, my sentence is falling apart. As it progresses, let's quickly march on to the third news item. Okay, I should say, before I begin this third news item, the link to the Paper Republic Give It a Go translation thingy-bob will be in the show notes. But yeah, this third news item is a self-referential one. It's about an upcoming series of episodes I'm planning to do. Now, a wee while back, I did a sci-fi series. It's exactly what it sounds like. I was covering Chinese sci-fi for about, I think it ended up being something like 6 episodes in a row. It was very fruitful. And I'm planning to do pretty much the same thing, but for wuxia and xianxia, wuxia's offshoot. So wuxia being Chinese martial arts stories, basically. Xianxia being the kind of fantasy version of that. I'm just going to call it the wuxia series, though. I think it's a more fun word. I like that letter W. Or maybe I liked WU, woo. Anyway, wuxia. I've got quite a lot of topics and guests lined up, but if you're listening and think that you could talk about a particular translated piece of wuxia, doesn't have to be one that you've written or translated, you could just be a fan, but if you would like to come on the show and talk about wuxia, then do not be a stranger, just get in touch. And even if you don't want to be a guest, if there's something you'd like to hear, or a particular angle or perspective, please do get in touch, because this is going to be different from the sci-fi series in the sense that I'm very uneducated. When I did the sci-fi series, this was after having done a master's dissertation on the topic from a publishing angle, and from having read quite a lot of the stories. This time, I'm really ignorant. So if you want to just take an opportunity to educate me, how can I say no to that? You'll probably be doing me a huge favour. But yeah, that's the end of our third item of news, and indeed, all of this episode's TrChFic news. So, without further ado, let's hear the interview that I had with Eric Abrahamsen about Gefei's Flock of Brown Birds. I always say this, but it was a really fun chat, and I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoyed, what can I say, conducting it, directing it, carrying it out, whatever. I'm sure you'll enjoy it.
Testing, calibrating the mic.
Nice.
As far as I know, that's fine.
That'll do it, yeah. So I'm on the show with Eric Abrahamsen. Hi, Eric. How's it going?
Hi, Angus. Doing pretty well.
Cool. This is something like the third or fourth episode in the row in the age of coronavirus. Is your self-isolating passing reasonably well?
Yeah, it's sort of by turns. It's frustrating and kind of enjoyable. You'll have a few days where it's just nice to be at home baking bread and hanging out with the kid or the kids, and then a few days of cabin fever and wanting desperately to get out. We had a week of nice weather in Seattle, which is rare for us here, and so I think everybody just sort of put coronavirus on pause and went out to the parks and walked around, and we had to get yelled at by our mayor to go back inside.
Well, what you say about cabin fever resonates, because I'm literally in a cabin right now, so... The upside is...
sounds fairly safe. That sounds like the best place to be.
Very safe, yeah. I was talking with my family on Zoom, actually, where we are right now. They were talking about the weekly ritual that's become a thing in the UK, where everyone claps for the health service and other essential workers. Mm-hmm. But that's not happening out here in the countryside, where there's like 2 other houses. So...
And you'd look like a fool just coming out and clapping all by yourself.
Yeah, only the horses and the rabbits are going to hear. But yeah, we could keep talking about the virus, but that's literally what everyone else is doing. So let's just keep going. What can you tell the listeners about yourself?
So let's see. My name's Eric. I am from Seattle, where I am right now, but spent most of my 20s and my 30s in Beijing. First as part of a study abroad program to learn Chinese. Just never came home, and I stayed there for, I guess I was there for 16, 17 years altogether.
Right.
Yeah, so I was there for quite a bit. Thought I was going to be a journalist in the beginning. Turned out I wasn't a very good journalist. And in the time it took me to figure that out, I got better at Chinese, and my sort of original love of literature came to the fore, and I ended up sort of sliding sideways into translation.
Was that a journalist concerned with China, or just a journalist in general?
Just journalism in general turned out to be harder than I thought it was. I worked for a local English language magazine in Beijing for a couple of years, which was fun, but it was sort of like a, it was like a listings entertainment, bars and clubs kind of
It
magazine.
wasn't That's Beijing, was it?
It was the very one. That's Beijing.
This podcaster used to be an intern for That's Shanghai.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, that's hilarious. These are small worlds, worlds that we're moving in here. Yeah, I was there. Let's see, I got there sort of just as Mark Kiddo was getting pushed out, and it became, the names changed. It went from That's Beijing to The Beijinger, I think, at some point around that time.
Right. Well, speaking of small worlds, I might have relayed this anecdote on the show. I'll be as fast as I can. My entry to China was like a TEFL teacher in a random wee school in the sticks, and I happened to be in Wukang Town, Decheng County, which is right next to Moganshan, where Mark Kittle's book China Cuckoo is set. And the school I was teaching at, Moganshan Foreign Language Primary School, was where in years past his kids were. So I knew about Mark Kittle first because of my essentially random little provincial school I was sent to by the company that served as an agency and sent me there. And then later, returning to China and getting that little internship, found out, well, I actually already knew that Shanghai was his company because China Cuckoo says as much, but it was not planned at all.
That's amazing. And semi-coincidentally, to continue this chain of events, Moganshan was the location of the first BCLT Sino-English Literary Translation Training course, of which there were 3.
Right.
And the Moganshan one was the first and kind of represented the earliest, like, real cohesion of Paper Republic as an organization, or it sort of cemented what was already there de facto. So that place is dear to my heart. We would do our translation training seminars during the day, and then in the evening everybody would gather at Mark Kiddo's bar/restaurant/ carousing locale, and we get very drunk in the evening.
That's fantastic.
Fond memories.
I've had breakfast at his hotel. I've not had the evening's entertainments. What was the acronym you rattled off there? BCLT, was it?
BCLT was, I don't think it's even called the BCLT. So it's it was part of the University of East Anglia, and I think it was the BC. What did that stand for? Anyway, I think it's called Writer Center Norwich now, or at least there's kind of like a confluence of several organizations, and they have these translation training courses that are sort of modeled off of the MFA creative writing seminar modeled off the model. So there were 3 of those in China, in Moganshan, in Suzhou, and again, I can't remember the other one was in Anhui, I think.
Right. And
I was a student at 2 of them and an instructor for the 3rd. Anyway, those events are very near and dear to my heart. Really, really enjoyed those. But to get back to the sort of
Moganshan and Anhui, quite a nice little not Jiangsu, Jiangnan sort of area.
Yeah, and all of them in really nice environments, like very, very nice sort of physical settings.
Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Anyway, so I got ahead of myself there. It was That's Beijing for a couple of years, and then I thought I was going to be a freelance journalist, pitching stories to newspapers and magazines, which turns out to be really difficult. To make a living at that, you need to do 2 or 3 stories a week, which means you're not really going deep into anything. You're kind of just rattling things off. You're constantly pitching. You're getting $200 an article. It was just highly stressful and sort of depressing. Yep. Turns out that I'm missing some of the key skills to be a journalist, such as the ability to ask people uncomfortable questions that they don't want to answer, and also talking to people on the telephone. All these things are things that I'm bad at. So eventually I sort of realized, oh man, is just not going to work. What I should have done was get a proper job, but I was trying to be a freelancer.
Mm-hmm.
And about that time, I'd started to read Chinese fiction. I had started to do a little bit of translation, not with any, great plan in mind, or, no idea of a career shift or anything like that. But literature's always been my first love. And so it seems like sort of a natural thing to get into.
Yeah, it seems like, to me anyway, there's no path to turn literature into a career except kind of weird, magical paths that you just find yourself, unless you're really good at applying for jobs that everyone wants.
Oof. And some of us have tried to get into publishing and had difficulties with that.
Yeah.
I've sort of ended up in a semi-publishing role now, but it's very much sort of unorthodox, and it would be very hard to get a straight up job in the publishing world.
Mm.
But yeah, I've got this sort of odd career now, cobbled together of various contingent random bits over the years.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Paper Republic there just a minute ago. Can you tell the listeners, well, I've told the listeners a few times what Paper Republic is, but maybe what you can do that I can't is tell the story of Paper Republic, its origin story, so to speak.
Sure. It came about because a bunch of us who were interested in Chinese literature or already doing translation in Beijing got to know each other and started hanging out. So there's Brendan O'Kane, Cindy Carter, Jim Weldon, I think Joel Martinson and Alison Leal were there from the very beginning. And so we all got to know each other, and we sort of ended up like at the Beijing Bookworm, drinking in the back and talking about literature and arguing with each other. This was before the first BCLT summer course.
Right.
And at some point, I think we decided it would be good to have like a group blog where we could put up some of our information and thoughts about things we were reading or trying to translate. And I think that was the origin of the website. I distinctly recall, I could be making this up at this late remove, but I recall us all being in the back room of the Bookworm talking about what we could call this website. And somebody coming up with, we were playing on the usual Chinese cliches, and we were something, the PRC, the Republic of China, Chinese Republic of Paper, and then somebody turned that around to Paper Republic, and then we had it. And so
it's a really cool name.
I like it. It sort of fits, it fits us in a lot of different ways. It's kind of a nation of the mind. It's an idealized, non-existent fraternity or sorority or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I'm very pleased with that. People don't, it doesn't always immediately make people think of China, but I think that's okay too. It's better than something with like pearls or silk or dragon.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good. I mean, I think it has a little tiny bit of the connotation of just paper tiger, but it's not. Right. Yeah, it's not like the Great Literary Paper Tiger Society or something like that.
Yeah, sometimes people do call us Paper Tiger, which is unfortunate. But whatever you choose, it's gonna have something wrong with it.
Do you own any of the other Paper Republic, the notebook companies' products, or have you ever?
No. We're engaged in a quiet search engine optimization war against. I think it's an Irish stationery company called Paper Republic. I'm sure they're lovely people, but I always sort of. Every once in a while, like every 6 months, I'll Google us and just make sure, see who comes out on top. Not that it matters at all. I mean, you're never going to be searching for the same things at the same time.
Oh.
But I did think that was funny to see that there was somebody else with our name.
I wish you good luck in the wars to come, as they say in Game of Thrones.
Thanks.
Yeah. I remembered what it was I wanted to say earlier when you mentioned how one skill that you felt you maybe lacked is asking uncomfortable questions. Well, sometimes I imagine like an alternative universe version of my podcast where I needle and attack all my guests, but it's not really what I do. But with that in mind,
so easy to attack translators. It's like we have no defenses whatsoever. First of all, the work itself is always some degree of failure, and then we as people, translators as people, are often not very good at online debate. Yeah,
and I feel like with any discussion about China has the potential to get fraught, and it would be so easy to be nasty and have a go at people.
I've been so careful over the past, well, it's worse in the past year now, or really just the past few months. I've been so careful on, Twitter or wherever to just shut up.
Yep.
I don't have anything useful to contribute to that argument. I'm reading what's out there, but people are just popping off the handle so easily with such ridiculous arguments. I just thought, this whole thing would just be better avoided. I'm just not going to participate. We do have a WeChat group with a bunch of translators, Chinese authors, and Chinese publishers, as well as some random literary people who are involved in the promotion of Chinese literature abroad. And that That group has stayed fairly civil. We've gone up on two wheels a couple times, I think, but every time we've sort of managed to bring it back down. So that's remained civil and a place where we can have some real conversation. So that's been nice to see that.
It's fantastic. Here's for diplomacy and keeping an even head in this weird world we live in. So speaking of friendly questioning, let's get on to the main body of the interview, and I'll ask you some friendly questions about our author for this episode, who's Ge Fei.
You can needle a little bit.
A little bit. Well, they do call them needles, not swords, don't they?
Exactly.
Yeah, I won't swing the interviewer's beheading weapon at you. Anyway, Ge Fei. The Claymore, yes, for representing my culture, Scottish culture.
That's right.
I'd need two hands for that, and that is a good thing about podcasting. I have both hands free. I'm not holding a pen or anything. Right. So, Claymore talk aside, Ge Fei, a question occurs to me that's not in my list of questions here. Ge Fei is his pen name. So, I wonder if you could tell me what's his real name, and does the pen name Ge Fei mean anything, or is it just sound nice?
I was just thinking of that this morning. His real name is Liu Yong, which is just sort of like a very standard, bog standard Chinese name, and you could see why. If you're trying to be if you were trying to be a writer, you might ditch that and give her something more interesting. I was thinking this morning as I was going back over some of his writing, I was trying to think, what on earth does this actually mean? And I'm very bad at interpreting Chinese names, apart from Mo Yan, which is sort of the big obvious one. The others are sort of Ge Fei. I mean, ge as in squares or blocks or slots into which you can fit things. Fei is as in like a general negation. So maybe he's saying that he's a round peg in a square hole.
All right.
Maybe that's a facile interpretation, and then there's really more to it. I mean, I'm sure he'd be annoyed as all get out to have his name analyzed. But the best that I can think of is that maybe it means he doesn't fit. One who does not fit in. That's what I'm going with anyway. Well, don't tell him I said that.
I could see that. I guess I could see that as we'll probably get into as this interview progresses. We'll maybe see how that idea of being a little bit different in one way or the other fits either his writing or this piece of writing, his writing as a whole, or his identity as a writer. Because the tag that seems to be attached to him, at least if you go looking, is that he's a avant-garde, a member of something called Xianfeng Wenshui. So Wenshui being literature, and Xianfeng, I didn't try and look up what that means. I'm assuming that means avant-garde. I don't know if that's right or not. So it's basically a one-on-one translation. It's just avant-garde literature.
Yeah, Xianfeng, I mean, literally is sort of the spearhead or the tip, the point. It's the forward point. So it's avant-garde.
Cool. Right. Yeah, makes sense. What I've read about Ge Fei being identified as Xianfeng or avant-garde is that he might not agree with that. So where does the truth lie here? Is that a misleading label, or the Ge Fei rightly rejects? Or
I think it's a label that doesn't really mean all that much anymore. My understanding of Xianfeng is that this is something that came about in the 80s when, at that point, Chinese literature for several decades had mostly been sort of Stalinist, social realism, pressed into the service of politics. And in the 80s, with this influx of translated foreign literature and the lifting of sort of political demands on the arts and literature in particular, people just started writing whatever the hell they wanted. And my understanding is that Xianfeng basically just means, writing that is no longer this socialist, realist, Stalinist, stuff in the service of the state. It basically it indicates literature that's gone back to what it normally is in other times and places, which is the writers writing whatever the hell they please. So I don't think that I think it's useful in sort of a historical sense, because that's an enormous historical moment in contemporary Chinese fiction, is the revival of the 80s. But I don't think that it's very useful in terms of identifying styles or content or anything like that. I think it's basically just literature returning to its original nature.
Okay, that's a good way of looking at it. In an intro, or in a preface rather, because Flock of Brown Birds has a little author's preface. Ge Fei talks a wee bit about the reopening up, or whatever you would call it, of literature in China. He says that things that had been shut out of China essentially came back in, and it was the writers he cites are all kind of like European modernist writers. And the list of names is actually more non-fiction writer, or maybe half non-fiction writers, half fiction. So I've got the preface in front of me. He says something. I was greatly influenced by the writing of Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Heidegger, Freud, and Wittgenstein, as well as the fiction of, so all those guys were philosophers basically, and then we have some fiction writers rattled off here: Kafka, Joyce, Borges, Proust, and Garcia Marquez. And then he says how there was a modernist movement emerging in Chinese literature. And the thing that struck me right away was it seems almost like China was having a modernist movement opened up out of a time capsule, out of sync with literature in the rest of the world, or at least the Western world. Is his description of that, in your view, kind of an accurate one, or is it just one that suits him?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I always sort of regret being too young and not being in China. That I would have liked to have been there in the 80s. I think it would have been a lot of fun to see basically this culture roaring back to life. All these new works of literature being translated into Chinese. The translations at that time were often done by writers, by Chinese writers. So and oftentimes they were particularly good translations. And there's sort of so the novelists that he lists there, with the addition of maybe Kundera and Italo Calvino, it's the same roster that most Chinese writers who came to prominence in the 80s, they were all reading them. Marquez in particular had a big effect on Moyen. Borges and Italo Calvino sort of lent this their imaginative power to Chinese writers. Kundera had sort of the confluence of politics and humor and storytelling, sort of that gave Chinese writers kind of a way of attacking politics through literature. Those writers were enormously influential in the 80s, and in a way, no other foreign writers have really replaced them as having that much of an influence. I think after that, Chinese literature then had its own new canon. It had its own group of writers in the 80s who became sort of those who revived Chinese literature. And so Chinese literature became less dependent on these foreign imports, basically. But at that time, those books had an enormous impact on Chinese fiction, and you'll still hear writers like Yu Hua, Moyen, Goethe, you'll still hear them talking about Borges, about Kafka, about Marquez. Those are still sort of the touchstones for modern Chinese literature. And sort of later Western writers, European, South American, American, just haven't had quite the same influence on Chinese literature.
Right. What you've just said there makes me think of, again, things Goethe said in his preface, which is pretty short. He said how basically this particular story that he wrote in the 80s, quite early in his career, is like really of that particular moment. So I'm just going to quote what he said here. Despite being its author, I found it extremely tricky to come back to this piece after 30 years to write my reflections. China has been in a constant state of flux during this time. Very true. And art and literature have been choked by the constant need to readjust its perspectives and focal distance in relation to society while struggling to find a sense of its own existence. And then this is the main part that was jumping out at me just coming up here. The social system and cultural atmosphere that gave birth to, nurtured, and encouraged pioneer literature, I guess that maybe means Xianfeng Wenshui, avant-garde literature, no longer exists. So basically he's saying this book is kind of a product of its times. Those times are gone, and so things like this aren't really going to be written anymore. Do you think that's more or less true?
I mean, who knows what he's talking about exactly? Like that preface is a little bit of a cop-out. He's basically like, I reread the story. People have asked me to explain it. I still can't explain it.
Right.
And that was basically the preface. So it's like, thanks, Goethe. I think, let's see. I think that writers at that time in the mid to late 80s had sort of an open field to a certain extent. And a lot of them were very idiosyncratic pieces of fiction. These were writers who sort of did deep dives into their own heads, into their own aesthetic points of view on the world, and came up with books that were really, really quite unique to them, and very sort of just very, very personal and sort of very dug up from someplace deep is, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
And I think that very true to the book. Yeah.
Yeah. You can see this. I mean, this flock of brown birds it feels like some weird fever dream he had, and he woke up and he wrote it down. Mm-hmm. And I think the, fiction over the past 20 years or so within China has been much more sort of socially contextualized. It's much more contingent. People are paying much more attention. There's more of a social literary hierarchy. First of all, there's more of a literary society that people are dealing, and there's also much more of a feeling like a need to sort of, that literature needs to reflect what's going on in the big picture. Whereas I think in the 80s there was a lot of writing that just reflected what was going on in the writer's own head. And that's, an ugly generalization, but I think to a certain extent it holds up.
Yeah, I mean, you can have a surreal sort of book, which is like a dream detached from society, or like some historical context. And then you could have a magical realist sort of book, which is just a magical version of some stage of history. Right. I'm not going to say what it is, but I've been involved in kind of like the production of a translation of a Chinese author's work of like magical realism, and it is a very strange little book, but it's all about the industrialization of a region. It's a real place, a particular time, I think in the 80s, and that, although it's a lot of strange things going on in that story, it's grounded in a way that this one's totally not. This one I feel like it's called Flock of Brown Birds. Maybe one reason because the book itself is, it's flying here and there.
Yeah, and it's sort of hard to grab onto. It's made of all these little pieces, and you sort of, when you reach out and try to grab it, your hand just goes right through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we can ground our own conversation a little bit, you were involved in, I think, editing or helping to put together a series of little books, which this Penguin edition of Flock of Brown Birds is contained in. So there's, I think there's 4 little books in this series. We'll talk about them more later on, but just to rattle them off now, there's this one by Ge, Flock of Brown Birds. There's Radish by Mo Yan, which I've covered already on the show. And then the other 2 are Petulia's Rouge Tin by Su Tong and Marrow by Yan Lianke. So we will talk more about the series as a whole later, but what I want to ask you about Flock of Brown Birds, or Ge particularly, was he as an author like a write-in? Did you definitely know you wanted him in this series, or was it more of a painstaking choice, picking him out from lots of strong contenders?
Yeah, I definitely knew I wanted him in there. When I first started thinking, so Penguins had that line of short pieces, Penguin specials for a long time. So this was basically just me pitching some books to be included in that line. Right. And I didn't, the 4 you rattle off, I know we'll talk about this later, but I just want to make clear that Su Tong came later, and that was not, that was after I only did the 3.
Oh, right. Okay.
The Mo Yan Lianke and the Ge, so the Su Tong was later.
Right. I didn't know that.
So basically I went to Penguin and I said, there's a whole bunch of really great novellas out there that nobody's translating because nobody wants to publish novellas. And they said, well, we've got this, this great line that's specifically for short to medium length pieces. And so I went through, having said there's all these great novellas out there, I had to go back and sort of figure out what they were. And I think I knew Ge, I wanted him in there. I believe it was Kanan Morse at the time, because Kanan Morse is fairly deep into Ge. And I think that he was the one who had read it recently and said, oh, you got to put this in there. So I got that from him. And Kanan's gone on to translate more Ge for the New York Review of Books, some of which has come out, some of which is forthcoming. Yeah. So I think Mo Yan was obvious, Yan Lianke was obvious, though I didn't know which one. And then Ge was definitely right from the beginning. This was something we wanted to.
I actually have one of the other English Ge book that you can buy right now on my bookshelf. It's The Invisibility Cloak. Kanan Morse is the translator behind that. I think my edition of that is also Penguin, though. So I wonder if New York Review of Books sold the rights to publish that elsewhere.
Is it really Penguin?
Let me check. Oh no. I'm completely wrong.
NYRB, right? We actually acted as agents for that book, so I'm pretty clear. I was there for that, for the rights sales, so I'm pretty clear on that one. Though I thought it was possible that they had sold it to Penguin.
I'd like to talk more about the other Penguin specials books later on in our chat, because there's quite a lot of interesting China-related books in there. But focusing on Ge right now, this question is going to circle around and return to Kanan Morse. But first of all, I've got to read the start of it. Ge studied at East China Normal University in Shanghai, and he's from Jiangsu province. And Jiangsu and Shanghai are all in the kind of approximate region where I lived in China and spent a lot of time exploring. Jiangnan, I talked a bit about what Jiangnan is very early on in the podcast with the translator Dong Li, because he'd translated one of the poet Juju's poems. The poem's title was Jiangnan Ningguo, and I think he called it South of Yangtze Republic was the English title for that poem, which is, I think, nice. in our chat, we're like, that's a nice name. He said, yeah, how could you possibly do better than that without a huge footnote explaining what Jiangnan was? So I guess I'll try and rattle off my definition of it now. It's like a particular region of China, south of the Yangtze River, which is green and fertile. It has lots of canals. It's associated with like arts and literature and prosperity and nice, not like wild, rugged landscapes, but like pleasant landscapes. That's my understanding of Jiangnan. And it's something I felt kind of strangely attached to, maybe because I lived in Zhejiang, then Shanghai, and saw a lot of Zhejiang and Jiangsu province, which are two parts of Jiangnan when I was living there. So all this is getting to the point that I was reading up on Gefei, and I was kind of pleasantly surprised to see that what's regarded as his big work in Chinese is this Jiangnan trilogy, and the first of which, initially I thought it was already existent in English, translated by Kane and Morse, but I've learned just today it's not actually out yet. So I guess the question I'd have for you is, does Jiangnan mean anything to you, apart from just being a concept? And do you know much about this Jiangnan trilogy?
I think, the division between North and South in China is sort of like the grand cultural divide of China, and it's historical, it's culinary, it's, the way people look, the way they talk, it's aesthetic, it's economic, it's geographical. I mean, it's really sort of the big split.
Right.
And I think, as somebody who spent all of his time in China, in Beijing, I'm kind of I'm obliged to be sort of a chauvinist for northern China. I know. We can. You get your Claymore, I'll get my. I don't know what.
That's the weird thing. In the UK, in the UK, I'm a northern guy. I'm from Scotland. But in China, I kind of my allegiances are a bit different. And
there's a little bit of similarities. The north-south divide exists in a bunch of different places, and it's often like, the northerners are the bigger, stronger, brasher, ruder, cruder, more direct, more hale and hearty, sort of hail fellow well met kind of people. And the southerners are supposed to be, have more delicate sensibilities, be sort of politer, more cultured, more educated, perhaps slightly effete in the view of the northerners. There's all these, stereotypes, and they definitely obtain in China as well. So I've spent all my time in the north. I'm sort of an obligatory northerner, though when it comes right down to it, the authors that I like the most actually do tend to be from the south, from Nanjing, from the Shanghai area.
Right.
So that's, I don't know, it's like one of those distinctions. It's just not worth getting into big arguments about. No, you can really feel a difference, and I think that Jiangnan literature maybe it tends to be a little more place focused, a little more intricate, a little more delicate in its sort of in its sensibilities, as I just said. It's possible that you could see that kind of a commonality between it. To my embarrassment, Gefei's major trilogy here, the Jiangnan trilogy, I actually haven't read. This is a moment of shame for myself. This is something I should actually. I will take the quarantine days here to find a copy of these books and read them. I should have read them years ago.
Yeah.
My only impression, what I've heard about them, is that they're a little bit different from his shorter work, in that they're a bit more normal narration. So a lot of his short stories and novellas, as we've seen here with Flock of Brown Birds, are odd in some way, or experimental,
yes,
or have some sort of strange narrative thing about them. And what I've heard is that the longer novels are a little bit more straight ahead. And you could see in something like The Invisibility Cloak, you can see him sort of like halfway between those two worlds. It's a fairly normal novel, but there's just odd things about it. It's not out and out like bizarre, but there's just little odd moments where things
and maybe the tone as well.
Yeah, and the tone is, you keep thinking, well, God, there's something else going on behind the story. You keep thinking there's gonna be some like big revelation of something bizarre is about, that something's about to happen and it never does. So maybe that novel is kind of placed between his Jiangnan trilogy and his shorter works, whatever.
Right.
That's what I've heard about the trilogy.
It occurs to me, with all the talk about Kane and Morse, he's not the translator of Flock of Brown Birds. The translator is Poppy Toland, who's a name that's popped up quite a few, appropriately, popped up quite a few times in my I guess my journey through translated Chinese fiction / my journey through doing this podcast. But I think this is the first translation by her I've ever read. Is this wee book? So what can you tell us about Poppy Toland?
She is. I wonder, have I met her? I think I've met her in London once. Oh well, never mind. You can take that part out. That's meaningless. Poppy's one of the most active and skillful translators out there. She's done a bunch of novels, a bunch of short stories. I edited this with her, and she's done several short stories for Pathlight Magazine, which is this silly journal that we do. She's great. She's very solid. She's got a great sort of literary style. She's somebody you should have on the show. She's got a lot to say about Chinese writers and Chinese fiction.
Yeah,
I had originally. Because the recommendation to do Flock of Brown Birds originally came from Kanan, so we were originally talking about having him do this translation as well. But in the end, Penguin went with Poppy,
right?
And it came out great.
Yeah, I have to say it's. I said this about Radish as well, but I felt the same way here. The prose in this book the English prose is absolutely a pleasure to read. It's not too in your face, but it's also just, I don't know, it's pretty or it's pleasing. The words themselves are pleasing. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, indeed.
That's success then.
That is success. It's a page turner, and there's only 50 pages, so it's over before you know it. Yeah. So just rewinding slightly, what you were saying about Jiangnan writers, quote unquote, and rewinding further back to what I'd said about there being other Penguin specials books dealing with China. I'm just bookmarking this as something to maybe bring up later. There's a little series of Penguin China specials books, which are called the Zhejiang series, which are little, I guess, short stories and novellas by writers from Zhejiang. And I was just looking up to see if they're all on Amazon or whatever, and I've learned that they're pretty recent. They're just from this year or last year, I think. Oh. I've not got any of those or read any of them. Have you seen anything about those?
No, I haven't. No. Is the Sutong part of that series?
No, I think it's all writers who are lower profile in the West, maybe lower profile in China than the authors in this series. I don't have the names in front of me, but it's not the easiest series to find information about online. Maybe the marketing for them is forthcoming. But I might put a link to some information about that.
This is sort of one of the awkward things about Penguin China is that they are owned directly by Penguin Australia. So oftentimes the books they do in translation are published in Australia, but not anywhere else, which has been a headache for them for a while, I think. So that sometimes that can make it difficult to find these Penguin specials. I know that for instance, the Yanlianke was later bought by Grove Press, which publishes Yanlianke in the U.S. and included in a collection of his novellas. So like these Penguin specials aren't even distributed in the U.S. In the U.S., they're the text goes to someone else or doesn't go anywhere at all.
Yeah, well, a little bird, maybe a little penguin, did tell me the Zhejiang series were done in partnership or in some kind of working together with the Zhejiang Publishers Association. So
that happens.
Yeah. I've actually met the Zhejiang Publishers Association. This is a very strange little story, or a funny wee coincidence. They were visiting Scotland whilst I was on the Publishing Masters course at Edinburgh Napier, and it just so happened that for whatever reason the first little stop on that visit was in my university's building, and it's Edinburgh Napier. It's not like the big famous University of Edinburgh, and there was a talk there by someone from Hachette and someone else, and then they got on the bus to DC Thomson, who are a big publisher in Scotland and the UK of like newspapers, magazines and whatnot, because DC Thomson were trying to sell the rights to basically get some kind of rights in China sold for Dennis the Menace, not the American Dennis the Menace, the British one, to these people from Zhejiang. And DC Thomson are the biggest company basically in Dundee, where I'm from. So yeah, it's very surreal. And
That's bizarre.
It is bizarre. And the best memory I have of that little meeting was I think the British Dennis the Menace is a lot more naughty than the US Dennis the Menace. And for international listeners, he's basically just a bad boy with a dog. He's become a bit less naughty as times have become kind of more wholesome, but he's still a bad boy. And one of the Zhejiang publishers put her hand up and said, "I'm curious if this character can find much success in China, because I don't think that Chinese parents will approve of him." And then it was quite amusing because I got to see the editor of the Beano, the magazine that Dennis the Menace is a part of, saying, well, actually, Dennis the Menace always learns that he has to look after his friends and his family and stuff. But yeah, it was a surreal experience. What a tangent. Let's march on.
What a cool connection.
Yeah. I didn't get any of their names or their WeChats, but yeah. So we've talked about Guffey, we've talked about the Penguin series. I'd like to talk about Flock of Brown Birds now. So a good way to start might be by reading the blurb. It's a pretty cool blurb. I'll not describe it anymore, I'll just read it. In this avant-garde novella, memory and time are subjective. A writer named Guffey retreats to the beautiful solitude of the waterside, the big W, to finish his novel, which is inspired by the revelations of St. John. He perceives ominous and portentous signs in the natural landscape around him, particularly in a flock of brown birds that flies periodically past his window. The arrival of a mysterious woman named Chi magnifies his anxiety and sense of temporal disorientation, calling into question his grasp on reality. And then after that, there's a little bio for the author, Guffey. So what I wanted to ask you, since this is a pretty hard story to like write a blurb for or pitch or summarize, my question for you would be, how would you describe this story to listeners who haven't read it in a way that might hint at the plot or the structure a bit more than that blurb did?
Okay, now it's when I'm having my quiet think.
I don't blame you.
I guess I would say it's the story of somebody who's undergone a profound emotional shock, something that has unseated his reason to a certain extent, perhaps tipped him over into a descent into madness or schizophrenia.
Right.
And the story of him attempting to retain his grasp on reality and to use the fact of being a writer and use narrative technique to keep himself attached and located and to maintain his grasp on what is real. I guess that's the best I can do. Maybe that doesn't really help readers understand anymore what happens in the story, but it seems almost pointless to go and talk about plot details because it just won't make any sense.
Yeah.
But I think it's very much, throughout the story you can see him attempting to find little tricks to hold on to what is real, to sort of remind himself of what is real and what isn't, to ascertain for himself and to sort of just give himself a sense of confidence. Yes, this happened. Yes, this person knows me. I have a relationship with this person. And it all starts with him, at the waterside, looking at these migratory birds and sort of telling himself, that as long as these birds are flying, that's a reminder that, the seasons are ongoing, that the rhythms of nature are still there. And that, in a sense, gives him a grounding in reality. Yeah. And the whole story is him just trying to hold on to that grounding. Yeah.
I think something that, this is not a criticism of the blurb, because I really love this blurb, but I think your answer hinted at something the blurb doesn't spell out, which is that although this is it's like a very short novella, it's kind of a story within a story. The writer / character Guffey at the waterside talking to this lady Chi is kind of a framing device for the story that makes up the main part of the 50 pages, which is like the story of this guy, how can I say, noticing a woman, following her, and then becoming more entangled with her. I suppose that's the best I can describe it in one sentence.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So it's not like there's no plot. It's just it's just sort of hard to know what's real, and which is his problem as well. I mean, that's his problem as a narrator, as a writer. What is real? We have the same difficulty.
And so I reread this story for this episode because I'd read it just for my own enjoyment a wee while back. And a lot of the things that jumped out at me on the second read that didn't jump out at the first were just how interwoven or imposed on each other the framing device story and the story inside are. And the other sense I got is that your description of it the description you gave it feels like one reading of it. It's probably the most logical reading, or the reading that makes sense of things in a rational way. But I feel like there's quite a lot of other magical or even genre fiction readings you could do. Like, to put it, my next question was a really blunt one. I was going to ask you what's going on, but it sounds like your description of your summary of the story there was like kind of like it was like an explanation, right? Like a solving of the mystery.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. What I said about this, maybe being a psychotic break and his ability to hold on to reality. I think what you said is right. That's the first reading that you would come to. That's like the initial interpretation the most obvious thing. But I'd be curious to hear. I mean, I think there are many layers to the story. I'd be curious to hear what else you're seeing in there.
Yeah, well, I remember in the preface, Gaffe says he doesn't quite know what to make of the story itself, or he doesn't quite know what it means. So I didn't feel under pressure. Like if there was some deeper mystery, I didn't feel totally under pressure for it to make sense. Just
Right.
had some kind of a sense to it. But yeah, there's. I think the blurb hints at time being weird, and the fact Gaffe is using the birds to get a sense of how time is passing. There were things that jumped out at me in the very first few pages that made me wonder if something even weirder was going on. This is really just my own my own kind of literary preferences coming to the fore here. But I wondered, is he trapped in some time loop? Has something dislodged in his mind that it's not really that he's insane and he's just not understanding time. Maybe something really weird and magical, like in a Borges novel, or Borges' story is going on. So let me try and find some evidence for what I'm saying.
Okay.
He says, but I can't see that the season is changing. Every day I wake to find a layer of white frost in the dark tiles of my roof. Oh yes, in the cold black night I observe strange astronomical phenomena. Shooting stars traveling in all directions at the exact same speed, and the moon distorted into the shape of a cherry. Assuming my memory hasn't been obstructed, then something must be interfering with time. Yeah. So immediately I'm imagining some, I don't know, strange force that's disrupted reality and trapped him in this little house by a lake. And the thing that leaped out at me on the second reading is that in the framed narrative, he's also beside a lake. It seems to be a different one, but what if it's the same one? And all this speculating isn't going to get to the bottom of anything, but I think that's maybe the point of the book. There's something really mysterious going on.
Yeah, and I remember that we had, this was quite a while ago now, but I remember that we had some discussion about that line, assuming my memory hasn't been obstructed, something seems to have gone wrong with time. And I think memory okay, this was like a remove of several years here, but I think the Chinese was something about 故障，我的记忆没有出故障的话, which is actually more often translated as just an error, like when your computer crashes or something like that. That's a 故障. So I don't remember what exactly our the discussion, why we ended up on with obstructed, maybe because it made more sense or something. But it seems at this point I kind of don't like it because it makes there's a passive sense to it. It's like my memory has been obstructed. Okay, so who's done the obstruction?
Right.
It sort of hints at like some other agency. Whereas I think if you just say my memory is, if my has ended, there's an error in my memory or something like that, then it's much more like, okay, something is going wrong with my brain. And so right. Yeah, you're right. He's saying either I'm crazy or something has gone wrong with time. And so maybe our first interpretation is that he's crazy. But maybe you're right. Maybe an equally correct interpretation is that something has gone wrong with time, and the changing nature of his relationship with this woman Qi, where like, is this one visit by her? Is it multiple visits? She treats him very differently on different visits. Maybe actually the two of them have a perfectly normal relationship. But maybe we and he are seeing different sections of it rearranged in time, which is why it's confusing to us. That's a possibility. That is a possibility.
Yeah. I think later on I'm going to reference a film director, but I'll just say for now, another thing I got reading the story is how filmic some of it is. One thing that jumped out at me a couple of times that recalled my time as an undergraduate student in film studies modules was learning about the different kinds of cut. So when you jump between scenes, you can do it by a jump with two totally jarring images. You can you could do a match cut where the camera movement, like say at the end of the scene, you move the camera right. The next scene, the camera is moving right at the same speed or something like that. Right, or you can match it on an image. So the one that your teachers in film studies always cite is Lawrence of Arabia lighting a match, and then it cuts to the sun, and the sun is the same point of the fire in the match. So that's a match cut. Literally a match cut in that case. And the one that really, it's not designed to jump out at you, or maybe it is. It's a bit where in the framing device story, Gaffe, the author / main character, is telling a story to Qi, and they've stayed up all night. And in the story he's telling to Qi, he's staying up all night talking with the woman who seems to have strange parallels with Qi, Why did I bring that up?
I was looking forward to it. It sounded like it was going to be something good.
Yeah, I think that was just to lead into the next question about the parallels between this the Chi, the woman who's come to visit Ge, and the woman he takes an interest in the kind of narrative, the story in the story. Who that woman we find out became Ge wife, but she, on the night of their wedding, she suddenly passed away. So like on my second reading, I was wondering, like, what is the link between these two people? Is one a doubling of the other? Is it literally the same person? Is Chi, who's visiting Ge, the ghost of his wife? Is it just a woman who reminds him of his wife? And then later, right at the end, there's a moment, a really freaky moment for me, where he thinks he sees Chi walking by the outside of his house. He approaches her and she just doesn't recognize him. And that reminded me of I think there's films and TV episodes by the director David Lynch that do this. Have you ever watched any Twin Peaks?
Yeah, sure have.
Have you watched the last season, the third season?
No, by the time that came out and I started watching it, I was like, man, this belongs to an earlier time of my life. I don't need to do this all over again.
Fair enough. Yeah, but one thing that happens in the third season is some character, I won't give anything away, but because there's been such a gap in time, I feel like David Lynch plays with that, but also there are other worlds involved and characters who should know each other meet each other, and one character thinks that they should recognize each other, and then the other one just blanks them, and it's like, who are you? And there's just something so weird and freaky about that, and I got the same, almost like horrific, that familiarity could be disrupted by something as simple as your friend or lover maybe not recognizing you. And there's another TV show that has a really freaky scene where it's two people who don't know each other, but one character is convinced that she really does know the other character, and then it causes him to doubt his own memory. Don't suppose you ever watched any of Mr. Robot?
No.
But again, a freaky thing that I associated with film more than literature. So what I wanted to ask you, now we're getting to the point, did you feel anything filmic or horrific in Flock of Brown Birds, or is that not something that sings to you?
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, to your point about the relationship thing, I think that our relationships with other people are one of the things that help us know who we are and where we are in the world. And the reason that is so shocking, that, suddenly she shows up and has no idea who he is because he was very much using that. He was using her as another sort of anchor to keep himself stable. And she kept hinting that they had all these friends in common, or that, they had this whole past together. She keeps saying like, oh, but surely you know who Lydia is. And he has no idea who Lydia is. Mm-hmm. But you can tell that he's like, okay, I'm going to play along, or I'm going to like search my memory. If she's saying this, then it must be true. It must be something about me. And so her presence and her relationship with him are really crucial to his own sort of sense of sanity. And that's why I think you're right, that hits so hard at the end when she shows up, and there's these little things that, like, when she shows up the first time, she shows up with a portfolio of paintings. She's got this big folder under her arm, and he says she came in with this folder and it looked like maybe an art portfolio, or perhaps a really big mirror. And she opens it up and he says, no, it's not a mirror, it's an art portfolio. And then when she shows up there at the end of the book, we're just giving away everything, but it doesn't matter. It's not like these are actually answers pages. There's only 50 pages. She shows up and she's got this thing under her arm, except this time it's a mirror. And he says, oh, maybe are you here to show me more paintings? And she's like, well, who the hell are you? And no. And also this thing that he thought might have been a mirror the first time around, this time it is a mirror. So it's just, everything is familiar and yet broken. And so you can sort of see that could be some sort of like a final blow to his sanity, or it's just a profound unsettling of it. What little sense of self he was able to piece together throughout this thing. Right. I also thought that there was a real important moment in the story when he's following this woman, and he follows her out into the countryside, and it's dark and it's snowing and night has fallen, and he's on this bicycle, and he meets another bicyclist coming the other way, and they sort of brush shoulders, but he doesn't get a good look at the guy, and then he goes on, and then he gets to this bridge. And he knows that she's gone across the bridge. He saw her like go onto the bridge and head across, but he can't see the other side. He gets halfway across, and a bridge keeper comes across and says, "This bridge is broken. You can't go across. You have to turn back." And he says, "Well, this woman just went across." And the guy says, "No, it's not possible. It's been broken for 20 years." And then they go back, and then he sees the bicyclist has fallen off his bike and frozen and died. on the side of the road. And so that whole scene was very horrific to me, and it's horrific in a very filmic way. I mean, that's the sort of scene you could absolutely see in a Twilight Zone episode or something like that. And it's actually so common that at the end of that scene, he's relating this scene to Chi, and she says, "Oh, this is the terrible cliche. I don't want to hear this stupid stuff. This is totally cliched." But it's obviously something that either happened to him or he remembers, and the implication is that the cyclist was. Or one of the possibilities is that this cyclist is he himself, that he actually died there, which in itself is another terrible Twilight Zone cliche, but I think also sort of holds the story together narratively. He's contemplating the possibility that he is dead, or that he has died in the course of the story somehow. So he could be inside life, outside of life. I don't know. It just sort of opens it up into new possibilities.
Yeah, I'm going to bookmark what you said about possibly being dead, and my mental bookmark is I have to remember that in relation to the revelations of St. John. But there's a question I want to ask first, because I thought of this when you mentioned the end of the story, when he meets who might possibly be Chi again. And another bookmark here, I want to mention doubling, the idea of doubling, but marching on. So when he meets Chi in the last, so in this edition, this English edition, this is the third last line of the story. It describes the beach he's on, or that his house is on, and where he saw Chi walking on, as an endless, so possibly a meaningful word there, endless, but an endless brown-red beach. On my first reading, that didn't mean anything to me. That was a color. On my second reading, it occurred to me he'd been going out of his way to describe the dress or the clothes that Chi is wearing, and he always says, I think, orange or brown, or red, and then in brackets, or maybe it's brown.
Yeah, he'll either say orangey red or brownish red or something like that, and he keeps sort of correcting himself.
So like who knows what this means, but the beach that he sees her on has the same color, and so who knows what it means? I don't know.
I really don't know. I really don't know. And I noticed that too, that he's so particular about describing the colors of the woman's clothes and the way she walks and her boots and all this sort of stuff. And I just don't know. So I don't know what he's doing there.
Okay, so the mental bookmark about doubling, he mentions that one of the people he was reading was Freud. And again, I seem to recall from my first year as an undergrad, on the mandatory Freud class in the theory module, we did the uncanny, das Unheimlich, and I think there was talk of how doubling relates to that. I forget exactly.
Yeah, the doppelganger and everything.
Yeah, it's a doppelganger. Yeah,
and I think that's absolutely what's going on in the story to some extent. And I think that is a core concern of fiction, and it's a core aspect of madness. Is that your mental image of the world somehow starts to diverge from reality, and ideally whatever sense of self you got and sense of, how yourself relates to the world, that would always be sort of tightly tied to what's real, to what you observe. But in one kind of madness, you can imagine those things beginning to diverge. And it's the same in literary art. You have a narrative that is ostensibly about the world, but that narrative can very easily diverge from what is real. And the act of writing a piece of literature about reality, that can reflect that same sort of madness that might happen in a person's mind if their sense of reality diverges from experience. So that doubling, I think, the eeriness that comes from the doubling, and also, him meeting another cyclist who's possibly himself and then possibly dies, and then she and his wife, and all these things happening. I definitely think that kind of split, between one and the other, and the distance between one kind of reality and another kind of reality, that creates a lot of the tension of the story and a lot of the discomfort of the story.
Yeah, I mean, you do hear stories about people who've had relatives who've had severe memory loss, and then this relative, let's say it's one's mother, your mother looks at you and looks at her family and is seeing the exact same people she should know, but for whatever reason, she's just really convinced that they've been body snatched. Yeah. They're not the right person. And it's not a million. I mean, it is a very hard thing to imagine experiencing, but it doesn't seem, having read something like this, where everything is strangely unfamiliar, it doesn't seem a completely inconceivable thing.
And I think that's supposed to be one of the aspects of how schizophrenia presents itself, is you're seeing what's there, but you're convinced that it means something else, or it's not what it appears. So I don't know, Goffey's really interesting. He, as you mentioned earlier on, you were sort of talking about his literary his literary influences, but also, he lists a whole bunch of philosophers as people who had a big influence on him. And he is different from other Chinese writers of the 80s in that regard. He's very well educated. He's a professor at Peking University.
Right.
And he's reading, fictionally, he's reading sort of the same stuff that all the other Chinese writers are reading. But I think that he's got a much more sort of systematic academic approach to ideas, to thoughts. He's got a much stronger philosophical background. You hear Mo Yan describe himself as a peasant, or Yu Hua sort of speaking with pride about how few characters he uses in his writing. Those guys they're not university professors, and Goethe is very different from them in that regard, in that he's got a much deeper intellectual grounding, and also that intellectual predilection shows up in his books as well.
Yeah. Now this reminds me of something I was talking about with Lihaila Heward in our episode about Radish by Mo Yan, another book in this series, where she was saying reading Radish, just for whatever reason, her little mind's eye reaction to reading the book, she wasn't picturing the characters as Chinese, or she wasn't visualizing the setting as China. It was looking more familiar to her. And then she wasn't sure why, but then it occurred to her a few minutes later, maybe that's because she's from a farming part of the United States, where like a rural setting where people's behavior isn't so different. And then I said to her, well, when I was reading that didn't happen to me reading Radish, but reading Flock of Brown Birds, I was not always visualizing Chinese settings, Chinese people. It often looked a lot more familiar, and I couldn't tell you necessarily what the characters looked like, whether they were like people who looked like me or Chinese, but the feeling overall felt either unspecified or sometimes Western rather than Chinese.
I felt that way about the invisibility cloak too. It seemed, the places and the names and everything were Chinese, but it didn't feel particularly Chinese.
Yeah, and on my first reading, I felt that was maybe because of the kind of bourgeois or educated or very middle class or whatever background Goethe has, and the kind of people and world he's writing in. And like, my background is not rural. My family are all either doctors or artists, and I'm from the suburbs. So maybe if it's Lihaila's way of looking at it, that it's people that are familiar to you and that affects how you visualize it, that would make sense. But on my second reading, I was looking at the cues that were in the book itself as to like where we are. And I felt like, whether this is in Poppy's choices in the translation or Goethe's choices as a writer, it felt either very unspecified or very Western in like the places and the situations. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'll try and think of some examples, like the places. Like the places where they go to drink are called inns. What else? There were other things as I was reading. The publishing house is just called Black Duck. It's not called like Jiangsu Province Publishing House. Things like small things like that add up, but are kind of invisible. Yeah,
that could be, and that could be part of the sort of destabilizing effect of the writing. I felt the only parts that really felt sort of recognizably Chinese to me were as his relationship with his future wife develops, and there's stuff about her, I guess her husband at the time or something like that, who's a drunkard, and all those things seemed a little bit more grounded. There's a little bit more environment, like the village or the places that they're in. You see a little bit more, and that started to feel a bit more recognizably Chinese. But you're right, the rest of it, I mean, people can sit in a hotel room and have a nervous breakdown anywhere around the world.
Yes,
doesn't necessarily need to be very grounded in location.
Yeah, probably the weird bit that I definitely visualized as China is when he tries to cross the bridge, and then little old man comes out of a wee hut and says, "No, don't cross the bridge." That reminded me of some experiences in China. But also, if you remember when we were talking about Mogan Shan earlier, here's a strange synchronistic little tale. So very early on in my time in that town near Mogan Shan, I was looking for things to do. I posted in the Hangzhou expats Facebook group. This English lady who was living on Mogan Shan said, the local government are trying to do a photo shoot for like tourism in the area. They basically need foreigners to hop on a bicycle and ride around Mogan Shan. Would you like to do that? And I said yes. And I got brought into this group mostly comprised of these like backpackers from England who were I was pretty clueless about China because I'd only been there a few days. They somehow seemed 3 times more clueless than me. We went on this cycling trip on this newly kind of concreted route through the mountain, but I guess as a lot of these paths around Moganshan and maybe in the Chinese countryside in general are, they had big ditches and there was no fence stopping you from falling in the ditch. And there was one little section where these little ornamental Chinese humpback bridges had been built. They were very small, so that meant they were very steep. And one of them came just before the incline went right down and the path swerved. So I actually saw something like what happened in this story. One of the people went off the ditch and onto some rocks and got quite badly hurt.
Ow.
Yeah. So that was another thing. When someone was in a bicycle in a ditch, I was right back in China. Yeah.
Bring us back each of us in different ways.
Yeah. But yeah, grisly anecdotes done with. No more of those. Let's talk about kind of the world of Penguin China, and particularly this series, the Penguin China specials. So we already mentioned before that you were kind of you pitched and you edited these 3 books, Radish, Flock of Brown Birds, and Marrow. Can you tell us a little bit more how that came about, if there's anything we've not covered?
It's just long been an observation of mine right from earlier on when I was sort of getting more familiar with Chinese literature, that novellas in particular are sort of a strong format for Chinese writers. And especially a lot of the big names now, when they were first coming out in the 80s, they were writing novellas, or they sort of try their hands with novellas. And so a lot of, and these are sort of like the earliest signs of genius with a lot of these writers who went on to have big careers and big names.
Right.
And a lot of these just had been overlooked. They hadn't been translated. And in some cases, I felt like they were some of their best work. I mean, Yan Ke, I like his novels quite a bit, but sort of I run kind of hot and cold on him. Like every other one, I'm not quite sure what to do with. But his novellas are just amazing. I mean, just like incredible works of literature. And I think that there's a collection of 3 called Nìyì. So the days, the months, the days. Jesus. This shouldn't be hard.
Years?
The years, the months, the days.
Oh, sorry.
Years, months, days, which is how it was published by Grove in the U.S. And I just think those novellas are amazing. Really incredible works of literature. No fat on them. Just very inspired. They know exactly what they're doing. Just very, very, very well written pieces of literature. And so I went to them saying, hey, there's all these great things just sort of lying by the side of the road. Nobody's been picking them up. So why don't we do something? I was trying to get something. I was aware that I had picked 3 male authors, and I was trying to get something more by female authors. And I was looking at Wang Yi, who's sort of of that same generation and that same caliber as these writers. And she's got a lot of good novellas as well, but the ones that I liked the best had already been taken or were being translated. So she didn't go in there. And then later on, I got distracted and we didn't keep doing it. But I think that those three are pretty strong.
Yep. And they look lovely on a bookshelf together, I must say.
They do. They have those nice, the series with the different colors, but everything sort of looks like, I'm very fond of that kind of thing. Penguin does good branding.
Absolutely.
And they've got some great nonfiction in there as well. There's David Moser did something about the development of the Chinese language.
Yeah.
Called like a billion voices or something like that. And I think Paul French has one in there. And then there's been the Sutong, there's been more translations as well.
Yeah, and they're quite nicely color coded as well. I've got a little a contact a contact formerly of Penguin China who should be a future show guest who just I inquired like what does the color coding mean, and she ran through it with me. So off the top of my head, because it's a voice message and I stupidly didn't write it down. These orange ones, this is the standard kind of penguin look, and your little trio, they're in the orange format. There's yellow ones, and they're kind of non-fiction. The ones that are about China seem to be concerned with literature. There's a Hong Kong series, which is red. There's that Zhejiang series, which are kind of a limey green color. They look similar to the color that was picked for Penguin Pocket Classics, which are color-coded by country. It's about the same shade of green they used for China in that. There's a dark blue series that are not Penguin China. They're Penguin, but they're from I think it's called the Lowy the Lowy Institute. So they're like papers about China. And there's the light blue ones that I think are the same color as Pelican, and those are non-fiction. And the ones concerned with China seem to be very much about economics and like geopolitics, big politics.
Right.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is there's lots of very nice Penguin specials books about China, and they come in all sorts of lovely colors.
It's really the colors that are an important part.
Oh yeah.
They look nice on the shelf. No, they're great. I think this 50 to 80 pages. I think that length is actually, I don't understand why there's such a hesitation about novellas in the publishing industry. They have this idea that they won't sell, but I just don't see why. I think that's the ideal length for so much stuff. There's, like I said before, I think a lot of the Chinese writers are doing better work at novella length than full novels. I think for nonfiction, like a lot of the nonfiction books that we're reading, like in the US or the UK, many of which grew out of like longer magazine articles, they just feel sort of pumped up to fill out 250, 300 pages, and frankly would have been just fine as like a 50 to 80 page short pamphlet, like a lot of, the sort of Malcolm Gladwell style, like idea books that just have one idea in them. And usually you don't need 300 pages of that idea. Like 50 pages would be fine. I wish more publishers would do this length of publication.
Yeah. And speaking just very superficially as a reader, for the little happy feelings books can give you, you can finish these things really quickly, and then you can tell yourself you read a whole book. But also the fact that they're not big and intimidating makes it you more likely to pick them up.
It gives the writer sort of more leeway to experiment or do whatever the heck they want, because they don't have to. It's just a shorter experimentation. And something like this Goffey, it's not like anything is lost by it not being 200 pages. In 50 pages, he takes you on this bizarre dreamscape journey. It's fully immersive. It's fully the effect of reading an entire novel. Yeah, it's just a little faster.
Yeah, I think it says in the Penguin Specials. Oh yes, there's a little thing in the fly leaf here. Penguin Specials fill a gap written by some of today's most exciting and insightful writers. They are short enough to be read in a single sitting when you're stuck on a train in your lunch hour between dinner and bedtime. They're concise, original, and affordable. So Radish, I did not quite read in one sitting because it's about 100 pages. This one, first time round, I read it in one sitting, easy peasy, on a comfortable sofa, the dark night outside, just like ideal conditions. Yes,
yeah, exactly. Excellent. Have you read Marrow yet?
Have I read Marrow? No, I've not got that one. I have an e-copy of the Sutong one, Petunia's Rouge Tin. I have a physical copy of Radish that I picked up at the Guanghua bookstore in London's Chinatown. But no, Marrow I do not have yet. But I'm thinking I might
get your hands on it.
Yeah, I'm considering splurging and completing this orange set, like treating it like the sets of houses in Monopoly. I'll complete this orange set, and then maybe in one fell swoop I'll get the yellow set, because that's got some cool titles.
Excellent.
Yeah. So a little bonus question, so to speak, about book length. I was talking in the last episode with Michelle Dieter about how some Chinese books and Chinese writers, some of the books tend to be very, very long. And the writers are sometimes, not making a value judgment here, but they're not edited very heavily. The role of the editor isn't quite as big. Right. Is that another reason why novellas from China in particular are maybe a good format that translators and publishers should?
I think so.
Yeah,
I definitely think so. I'd say there's sort of a two-part reason to this. One is the publishing environment. So editors are really not expected to do like major developmental edits with the writer. And this is in part just because they don't have that culture. It's also because the way the publishing houses are set up, they don't have that sort of long career arc. Editors at publishing houses don't have that long career arc that sort of allows you to grow in authority over the course of decades and like form long-term relationships with authors, right? Where you can sort of work with them as equals on their books. That does happen, but that's not sort of the norm. We ran publishing fellowships in Beijing for 3 years running a few years ago, and something that the foreign visitors would always say is like, why is everyone in the Chinese publishing industry under 30, and in many cases under 28 or 27? It just seems like a bunch of very young people. And I think just structurally the way the publishing industry works in China does not encourage that sort of long, slow development of editorial talent. And the writers are not accustomed to that. And basically what happens with the books is, they get sort of edited for typos and political problems. Yeah. And usually that's it. And I just don't think anyone writing a novel anywhere, it's hard. Writing a novel is like running a marathon. It takes a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of self-discipline, and a huge amount of time. And unless you are a very, very, very disciplined writer, everybody needs help from an editor. Mm-hmm. So I wish that was happening, and I wish that things would develop in that direction. I think another reason is more related to the break in literary traditions that's happened in China over the past 50 or 60 years. Basically, the original sort of Republican era, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, that kind of connected literary development was broken after the establishment of the PRC and stayed broken for several decades until the 80s when everything revived. And 3 decades is enough to kind of kill a literary tradition. It's enough to really break that continuity. And so people are, to a certain extent, they're starting to learn all over again how to write. And they did that, as we talked about earlier, with the help of a lot of translated fiction from abroad.
Yeah.
And I think that of all the technical lessons one can learn about writing, how to structure a long novel is one of the last lessons that you learn, and it's one of the hardest lessons to learn. You can read somebody else's writing and learn how to put together sentences pretty quick, because it's most obvious. The sentence level stuff is the most obvious.
And you can absorb that passively.
You can absorb that passively. You're learning to do it even without realizing that you're learning it. Characterization, all that kind of stuff. But really, the deepest lessons and the hardest lessons to learn are the pacing and structure of a novel. How to treat it like almost a architectural object. And those lessons you don't necessarily absorb unconsciously. You really have to go looking for it. You have to sort of sit down with a novel and read it, 4 or 5 times. How did this person structure it? How does it rhythmically, how does it move? How is it like a piece of music in three movements or something like that? Those lessons, and that sort of combined with the lack of literary instruction. There's no MF, well, there are, but there's very little sort of teaching of literature.
Right.
And you might get that in a class. You might get somebody, the structure of a novel, that could be a whole class. And I think that is happening less. So I think that just in general, Chinese writers are thinking less about their novels as, a structural work of architecture that they have to sort of adjust and think about from beginning to end. And they're more just kind of like, here I go, start at the beginning and write until it's done. And now it's done. And that's sort of a mean judgment and another generalization. But I think often that's what's going on.
Right. Well, at the risk of saying something a little bit related to politics and also generalizing, and I try not to say blanket statements like this on the show, but I think now could be a good time. So you're talking about how Chinese writers or Chinese literature as a whole is trying to kind of even now find its feet again, maybe not even link back with the past, but just get a tradition going and on a technical level, get editorial practices going. But surely that's going to be harder in a country like China, where the government has political direction or control of literature to some extent, compared with a country that doesn't. So to think of an example, I know nothing about South Korea or South Korean literature, but during the Cold War, they were also under an authoritarian regime. Now they're not. Do you think that would mean South Korean authors have a more conducive environment for establishing some literary institutions and traditions than Chinese writers?
Yeah, let's see. Politics. I would have said, up until a couple of years ago, I would have said that politics doesn't have as much impact on literature as people think, or at least the impact is not the kind of impact that people imagine when they think of.
It's not Soviet Russia, and it's not North Korea.
Exactly, and I think that the effects of politics are much more subtle, much more insidious, much less like a guy with a red pen in an office someplace scratching out lines in your manuscript. That does happen, but I think that the negative effects of politics are happening much earlier, sort of much more subconsciously on the part of the authors. I think that in terms of obstacles to developing a new literary tradition in China, it's been much more just the enormous pace of change, the way that society is transforming, the effects of commercialization, the sort of wrenching into the modern era. Things are changing so quickly. Authors are kind of scrambling to keep up. I think to turn your observations and experiences into convincing fiction, you might need to gestate something for 10 years, 20 years. It's like this slow process of mulching. And Chinese writers are just not getting that opportunity. Things are changing so quickly.
Right.
And it's just sort of, it's just like this, but every 5 years you're in a completely different situation, different concerns, different social problems. I think that's one of the hardest things about being a Chinese writer right now. It's just, you just can't keep up with it. Well, and, the writers keep saying like, reality is way weirder than anything we could come up with in our fiction. And I think that's still the case and continues to be the case with the coronavirus and the response to it. I mean, you can write about it, but Jesus, how long would it take to sort of sit down and really absorb and digest everything that's going on and turn it into fiction. By the time you do, there's going to be some other weird thing happening in society.
Well, this is kind of, at least it's got me thinking of my dissertation topic and regular topic of this podcast, Chinese sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Chen Qiufan. He's said things to the effect of reality in today's China is now sci-fi, and as a Westerner saying that, you could be accused of, I don't, what's the Nathaniel Isaacson used the term techno-orientalism, like thinking that blah blah rapidly developing Asian country is a vision of the future, as people maybe used to do for Japan, is not always the smartest thing to do. But on the other hand, if the just pace of change in China is too fast for realist fiction to keep up with it, then maybe that does lend an advantage both to stranger stories like this one, but also to stories that do deal with technology in the future. And
yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons that the sci-fi writers are in China are they're sort of having a heyday right now. They've got the tools for this. They have the tools already to deal with these sorts of problems and to look ahead and to see where China might be going, and they're doing a great job with it. TrChFic is definitely a great example of that.
Yeah, like I know a previous show guest and the kind of translator of Chinese sci-fi, Can Liu, he's quite skeptical about the idea of there being like a new wave or guaranteed continued success of Chinese sci-fi or Chinese sci-fi in translation. But honestly, like, I don't know, it seems like all the signs point to it continuing to be relevant for quite a while.
Yeah, who knows? I mean, he would probably have a better sense of the future direction of this than I would. But I mean, it already is successful. I mean, there already has been a wave of really successful, really interesting Chinese science fiction.
Yeah, I think he just takes that angle to avoid or to push back against silly generalizations that people might make. But
yeah, or predictions about the future, which is just a mug's game. I mean, I try as hard as I can to stay away from saying, what's likely to happen in the future. Nobody has any idea. And the other thing about politics is that it's getting worse. That I think that, we were just saying that it's not Soviet-style red pen censorship in the office kind of a situation in China now, but it's actually headed in that direction. And the situation for authors there is getting much, much worse. And there's a lot of I get a lot of moping and a lot of complaining from Chinese author friends, a lot of writing visa recommendation letters for people trying to get out of the country. I mean, it's bad right now. It's a really bad environment, and there's no immediate reason to think that it's going to get better.
Yeah. Well, what else can I say except that sucks, and I hope it does.
Yeah.
Well, things have got a little bit gloomy now. My next question was going to be about Poppy Toland, but we kind of talked a little bit about her already. Mm-hmm. So I guess I can ask you some miscellaneous questions now. So,
sure.
Or at least we can enter the category called miscellaneous, maybe where the story would actually best fit. So first question, it's about the word of the day, because this is something I try to do for every episode. And
oh shit, I think I forgot to.
Oh no! Word of the day. Well, we could make it. Would Xianfeng avant-garde be too boring?
No, I think that's fine, because you can go from there to a lot of other stuff.
Or maybe. Or how about memory? Since we've already explained Xianfeng, right. This is a word I don't know. So could you please teach me and the listeners, how do we say memory in Mandarin?
Oh, okay. It's Jìyì. So Jì is sort of the normal word for thinking of something, remembering something. Jìyì. So so a lot of Chinese words, there's if you want to come up with sort of the abstract noun, there's two characters that go together. Mm-hmm. But if you're using just sort of an everyday verb, it's usually the first character. So Ji is like, did you remember what Jibdo? I can't remember what she asked.
Okay.
So Ji is sort of the normal, just everyday conversation word for remember. And then Ji is sort of the larger concept of memory. And you might talk about, historical memory or somebody's memory isn't what it used to be. It's sort of a more general abstract concept for memory.
Right. So if we're talking about the narrator of this story, we want to use the big concept Jìyì.
I'm almost certain with that phrase about my memory being obstructed, I'm sure that he used Jìyì.
Right.
I'm not sure. I'll probably look it up and it isn't. But that's the sort of situation where you would use the full word.
I wonder if we can do a second word of the day, because the idea of the narrator it's a big thing here, because the narrator is also the author. So is there a standard Mandarin noun for the narrator?
Yeah, 叙事 is the usual phrase, is the usual word for narration, or narrative. I don't know, it's
叙事
used 叙事.
书社 okay.
And I think sure is just, this is another thing where I'll embarrass myself. Sure is just, like normal things or business.
Like matters, yeah.
Yeah, matters, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
Like make sure.
Uh-huh. Shu is just to relate, to recount, to tell a story.
Okay, cool.
So 叙事者 would be the narrator.
书社者 I remember I learned 者 because we did a story by Xùshìzhě Devourer, and I learned that was it Tushu?
Yeah, 吞食者, I think.
吞食者. Yeah. So
I think that's what it's called. Yeah.
Yeah. So 者, I guess that's like in English when we say like writer, the er on the end makes it a person, and 者 is like the one for that in Chinese. Cool.
That's pretty much exactly how it's used. Yep.
Yeah, I'm kind of convinced most of my listeners have better Chinese than me, but I think there are some listeners who'll be interested to know this stuff. So silly questions about Chinese words aside, let's get on to other kind of random questions. I just hope you'll humor me. I've asked listeners before what song a story makes them think of, but something about this one made me think of like sitting back and enjoying a beverage. But I thought, what beverage would it be? So if you could pair Flock of Brown Birds with a drink or a song, if a song springs to mind, what would it be? Because I'm asking this because I could imagine myself sitting down with a nice cup of tea by the lakeside. I could imagine myself sitting down with a coffee late at night, having a conversation, just like the characters in the story. Or I could imagine wandering into a murky place like the inn in the village in the story and having a glass of, I don't know, Guinness or a murky sorghum drink of some sort. Or I could even imagine having a clear glass of water and staring into it a little bit like Gofei does, the lake he's staying by. So all this justification for why I'm asking the question aside, what drink would you associate with this story?
Let's see. I think absinthe would be the obvious answer, but I'm not gonna go there.
No,
I kind of think like a very strong espresso,
right?
The kind that you drink and then you kind of regret having drunk it afterwards because you get too much of a caffeine high and it makes you a little bit jittery and maybe a little bit anxious.
Right.
He's trying so hard. There's so much effort in the story on the part of the narrator, like to grab onto things. He's so worried. He's so anxious. It makes me think of somebody like sort of their leg jiggling under the table as they sip an espresso they probably shouldn't have ordered.
Yeah, it's a strange thing that there are parts, I guess the narrator himself is a very highly strung character, but the feel I get from the story is dreamy in the sense of like kind of laid back and weird. It's like an cocktail. Yeah,
the environment of the story is almost lethargic in some ways in the dream sequences, but the man himself is just very, very tightly strung, I think.
Yeah. It's funny you mention absinthe because I think maybe an unconscious inspiration for that question is from this other podcast I listened to that I've mentioned on this podcast a few times, but it seems to be influencing the way I think a lot. It's called Weird Studies, and they look at whatever the weird quote unquote angle at various like pieces of literature or film or philosophy is. And an idea they cite, I don't know whose idea is that they're mostly using it to talk about drugs, the different kind of qualities that these substances have, and then like anthropomorphizing it. So the idea that there's a particular, like if you think of, I'll just pick alcohol because it's not illegal, that there's a particular spirit that lives inside alcohol, and when you consume the drink, that kind of imagined being manifests itself. And I think they were mostly using it to talk about different drugs, but they did mention alcohol, and the alcohol they mentioned was absinthe, maybe citing the film Moulin Rouge, when absinthe it's like a Tinkerbell fairy sort of thing.
Yeah, the Green Fairy is what they used to call it.
Yes, exactly. But that has absolutely nothing to do with this story. I just thought I'd mention it. Okay, last miscellaneous question. Are you working on any projects just now? I mean, we can assume you are working on Paper Republic in the general sense, but is there any specific things going on with yourself or with Paper Republic you'd like to plug, or any works that you've put out there into the internet or culture at large? Yeah,
no, there's a bunch of things I have on hand that I should be done with already, but I'm not. I'm editing Jiapinghua's Qinqiang, which is translated by Nikki Harmon and Dylan King, who you've had on, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So the two of them translated Qinqiang. Oh yeah. Well, there we are. It's a small Small world here. The two of them translated that. Amazon is going to publish it, and I'm in the midst of doing edits for that, so that's fun.
Oh, cool.
Speaking of like weird, dreamlike, intellectual Chinese novellas, I'm translating 93年的后半夜 by a Nanjing writer named Lu Yang.
Okay.
And so it was his Silver Tiger that I pitched to the New Yorker, I guess a year and a half ago or so, that they ran at the end of 2018, maybe? I can't remember. Right. So I did the short story Silver Tiger and then moved on to this novella called 93年的后半夜, which is literally means the small hours of 1993, but that's sort of I'm not sure that really works as an English title, so I'm thinking about that.
It's the year I was born.
Oh, yeah? Oh, geez. Well, this story will have probably no specific significance for you, but you can, maybe it's a good excuse to read it.
No.
Also he's a very sort of a very thoughtful writer. I don't want to say that it's intellectual writing, but he's just a very deeply educated, deep thinking author. That's a
conversation worth having in a future episode about the difference between thoughtfulness and intellectualism. But
yeah, and it's a thing that really, really stands out in Chinese literature. I mean, there are steep divides between sort of more, I don't know, we'd have to find a very sort of PC way of talking about this without deriding anyone. But anyway, it would be an interesting thing to talk about. But this story is very, very sort of philosophically inspired, and it's just also has some similarities to this story in that it's about a narrator who is locked in his own mind, sort of, and the difficulties of speech, of participation in society, the impossibilities of making connections with other human beings, all that kind of stuff.
The secret to that is podcasts.
Secret to that is podcasts. Where at one and the same time, you can sit in your room all alone, talking at a blank computer monitor, and at the same time be making connections with people.
Oh, no. So you figured out my secret. Oh, no.
Introvert.
It occurred to me, if you were looking for a way to talk about intellectual versus reflective. So I think everyone, or I say everyone, in the weird world of people talking about China on Twitter, anyone who makes an analogy about Confucianism gets ridiculed. But we're not on China Twitter, so I'm going to do it. And you can tell me if this is stupid or not. Maybe the difference, maybe as an analogy for intellectual versus reflective thinking or writing is Confucianism and Taoism. If I tweet that, and if people deign to even notice me, they would make fun of me. Is there anything to that?
I get a smackdown.
Yes.
Oh, I wish Chinese writers were drawing more on Taoism. I think generally what people say is Ah Cheng is one of the most sort of Taoist influenced Chinese authors, and with his King series, he's got a King of Trees, King of Chess, King of Children, something like that. That's been translated and published in English.
Those are very nice titles.
Yeah, really cool. Really cool writing, and very sort of like dug into nature, dug into that kind of language. I would say there's something Taoist about Mo Yan's radish in that boy's sort of interaction with nature. Like he's sort of he's like the idiot genius that shows up in a lot of Chinese fiction, but he's done really well, and he's got this sort of his sensory appreciation of the world. He's got like this synesthesia going on. Yes. His senses are cross-wired, and he's very much part of nature. So I would say if there's any argument for Taoism in Chinese fiction, that's an excellent one. That character of Blackie, or whatever we ended up calling him in English.
Just
otherwise, I would say not so much. Hey, hi. Oh, did we just leave it in Pinyin?
Yeah. I actually talked about that with Mihaila, and I think that was the best. Like I said, like you could have called him like Dark Boy or Black Boy, or like you said, Blackie, but that would have
Black Boy. That would have gone over really well. I know.
Yes.
There's just no good way of good way of handling that. Yeah, good. I'm glad we stuck with it.
It's alliterative. It's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, it actually does sound nice. But in general, no, I think here's an awful stupid generalization. I think Chinese culture in general would benefit from going back to its Taoist roots a little bit more. You kind of wish it would. And not just writers. But I think radish is there's an argument to be made that it's a bit of Taoist writing.
Yeah, well, the magic of podcasts is no one can screenshot your quote and share it without its context. Or they can. It's a lot harder. It takes more effort. They can't just do it with the snap of a finger.
Yeah, that's good, and that screens out most of
those people.
Most people.
A thing I noticed on this podcast that I was doing in the earlier episodes was I kept referring back to existentialism as like a way of interpreting the books. And it wasn't always because it really suited the book. It seemed to be just me projecting, not always projecting incorrectly, but that seemed to be where my head was at. And now it's definitely been more from like this weird perspective. I mean, you've probably noticed I've kept trying to bring up things like David Lynch and whatnot, and often it's not because it's the most appropriate way of looking at it. That just seems to be where my head's at. And now that you mention it, maybe not that I know very much about Taoism, but maybe I'm looking for those kinds of stories, not necessarily in Chinese writing, but stuff that is more quote unquote Taoist seems to be in my wheelhouse. But I'll have to read up on Taoism, because literally the only books I've read on it are the Tao of Pooh and the Tale of Piglet. I don't know if you've come across those.
I have. I mean, that's a fine place to start, but Zhuangzi would definitely do you a treat. Actually, get a couple different translations.
Yeah, I realize I've lied. I have read, I think I've read the Book of Changes, but it was a long time ago.
Man, that's trippy too. I'm not sure how much you're going to get out of that.
No, not much was the answer, but that was before I even knew I was going to live in China or was even particularly interested in China. So,
oh, cool.
Yeah,
it was Zhang Yimou's movies were sort of my entree to an interest in China. It turns out it wasn't anything like his movies.
Was it less colorful?
Less colorful and much less gongli. I didn't see gongli anywhere.
It's a shame.
But what I did discover is that the movies of his that I liked the most were filmed from Chinese literature, and that was actually sort of what turned me in the direction of Chinese fiction to begin with.
This is a completely random point, but color levels in China and just how strange things can affect reality. So obviously on smoggy days, just like from a visual, like a filmmaking perspective, contrast is lower on smoggy days, colors are less saturated. So in effect, you would get there that you wouldn't really get in Scotland, that shows you how subjective your senses are, I suppose, or environmental conditions are. It would be really easy to notice on a day when the rain had cleared away the smog. All the things that you thought were a little bit muted actually weren't. They were a lot more colorful than you thought. But yeah, that's not a question. This is just a meandering thought.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Except living in Beijing, it turns out they weren't actually all that colorful. Beijing's gray and dusty to begin with. What was nice was after the rains and the tree leaves got washed, and you would see actual, like, proper green leaves not coated in dust. That was nice. I'm
speaking from my place of Jiangnan privilege, I guess.
Yeah, it's nicer down there.
Right, that's all the miscellaneous questions, and I've certainly forced a lot of miscellany in there. So before we end the interview, I'd just like to take a chance to direct listeners to like further reading or further things to look into. And I figure you might be a really great person to ask. So if listeners enjoyed hearing about Flock of Brown Birds, or if they read it and love it, where else would you point them apart from maybe the obvious, the Invisibility Cloak, the other translated Gufei story? And you can go for anything. This doesn't have to be Chinese literature.
Oh, that's a little too large.
Okay. Sorry, zoom back in. Chinese books only.
Well, yeah, more Gufei, and more Gufei is coming. So the Jiangnan trilogy is coming out. I would definitely pick up a copy of I think they called it the Years, the Months, the Days, or just Years, Months. I don't know what they call it, but the Yanlianke novella collection from Grove Press in the US. What else? I mean, we've got all these short pieces on the Paper Republic website. We've got a section of the site called Read Paper Republic where we publish short stories or essays in full translation that you can read online. Yeah. And I think that's always a great place to sort of dabble your toes. And, you can go from there. You read something you like by an author who maybe has a novel in translation and go pick it up from there. So I would encourage people to look at those short stories and just and see what they think. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff up on there. And I've used it, I've read Fei Dao on there. I read Song Aman, the author we covered in the last episode there. Lots of fun things that you wouldn't necessarily find in print up on Read Paper Republic. Yeah. It's continuing that idea that sometimes the short stuff is the best. Yeah, and I do think, like, just personally, so the two Penguin China Specials books on my bookshelf, this and Radish, I feel like they're spiritually related in some way. Just maybe it's just by the weirdness, I don't know, the unfamiliar yet familiar realities. So if you guys who are listening have read Radish, I think you'd like Flock of Brown Birds, and vice versa. That's my suspicion anyway. Cool, I agree. Yeah.
And last question of all, Eric, what are you reading just now?
I'm mostly just reading this Jiapingwa book that I'm editing, unfortunately.
All right.
When I have time to do unrelated, unwork-related reading, it's Barry Lopez's Arctic Dreams. It's a big fat book about the Arctic. I've been on a British naturalist writer kick for a little while here, and so I'm about halfway through.
Cool.
Oh, well, he's not British, but anyway, I learned about it from Robert McFarlane, so it still counts.
So he's in that sort of wheelhouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool. Just last thing to say. It's a funny thing because I think when I interviewed Dylan, that was really early on in the show before I had the format, and he mentioned that they were doing this book, Qinqiang, and they were thinking of different ways to title it. And since then I've spoken to Nikki in real life a couple of times on the podcast, and she's mentioned and she went into a fair bit of detail about it when I met her at the Leeds conference on genre fiction. She mentioned Qinqiang Shanxi Opera a few times. It came up, I think Michelle Dieter mentioned it in our chat either on the show or off, and now you've mentioned it, and it's got its title now. It's going to come out through Amazon Crossing now. So it's been interesting getting little snatches of just hearing how that one's coming along.
Yeah, and it's I'm about halfway through it.
Yeah, awesome.
It's long.
Right. After all our dissing of long Chinese books.
I know. Except for this one. This one's great.
Yes, this is the good one. Well, Eric, I would love to keep on chatting, but I think my head is literally getting sore from sitting near a bright screen in a dark room for so long. So I should probably wrap it up now.
Excellent. Well, we can continue this at a later date.
So once more, a very big thank you to Eric for coming on the show. That was a fantastic chat about Flock of Brown Birds and so many other things. I really, really enjoyed that. Now, we've come to the end of the show. That means it's time for me to do the plugs. I'm going to try and get through them quickly today. So first one, it's about the TrChFic Discord. I've plugged this quite a few times, but just in case the message hasn't sunk in, if you are looking for a place to chat with other listeners of the show or myself in various specialized topics, for example, the sci-fi group chat that we've got going in there, the links to join will be at the top of the show's Instagram page and in the link tree, and pretty much the same goes for my Twitter. It's right at the top there in the link tree link in the pinned tweet. So speaking of Instagram and Twitter, that Twitter is my own one, at Angus Likes Words, but something like 80% of my tweets are just about the podcast. The Instagram is specialized for the podcast. It's at TrChFic, TrChFic. Speaking of TrChFic, just stick that on the end of patreon.com or buymeacoffee.com to support the show tangibly, and by tangibly I mean with your lovely, lovely money. The show is not quite free for me. I do have to pay hosting fees to keep all the files up there, and I get through a lot of tea bags in my daily life, and I need my tea habit to be funded, and that's where you guys come in. So yeah, if you want to give a monthly contribution to the show, Patreon's the place for that. The advantage of Patreon and becoming a contributor and whatnot is you get access to the bonus shows. There's hours of them up there. Yeah, what more can I say? That's the place to go to get access to those. If you'd rather give a one-off donation, or you're a fool and would like to give a recurring donation with no bonus content, go to buymeacoffee.com. Both of them just stick /TrChFic on the end. So there's one thing missing. The last plug. Obviously, that's all about the most important thing you can do for the show, which is spreading the word. Tell your friends, tell your families. Families? Well, maybe your family have a doppelganger. So tell your family, tell your family's doppelgangers, tell your estranged lover who's shown up on the shores of your curious lakeside home. Tell your editor who's chopping down your massive novel based on the revelations of St. John. And tell the strange man who guards that bridge that you tried to cross on a dark winter night. Please tell him he's very lonely. Until you do, 再见.